In order to effectively discuss Indigenous art in public places, we thought it was necessary to define what exactly public space is and how it differs from private space. These ideas are, however, very difficult to define, and their meanings have shifted dramatically over time. Within the context of European settlement, Susie O'Brien and Imre Saiman explained that the passing of the Enclosure Act in mid-19th century Britain effectively broke up what was once common land, used for grazing animals and public recreation, into parcels of private property to be used to the generation of profit by individual landholders. Public spaces, or spaces of leisure, were severely limited by this, and were often defined in relation to workspaces. Public spaces were only to be used after an individual had adequately contributed to the private sector, ultimately to the benefit of business owners. Ideas concerning public and private space are directly related to indigeneity and settler colonialism. In her article, Unsettling Ottawa, Settler Colonialism, Indigenous Resistance, and the Politics of Scale, Julie Tomiak explains the attempted elimination and erasure of Indigenous peoples in urban centers. Focusing specifically on the Ottawa region, Tomiak explains that settler colonialism has constructed the city as a white settler space, as outside of the purview of Indigenous contestation. She further explains that cities do not exist innately. Instead, they are created and maintained through discursive and non-discursive practices. These themes were also present in Glenn Coulthard's book, Red Skin, White Masks. Coulthard discusses the growing non-Indigenous population in the Northwest Territories during the 1960s and 70s, which occurred as a direct result of the federal government's increased administration of the area. He notes that the growing non-Indigenous population began to pressure the federal government to advance Northern economic initiatives, most notably in the form of non-renewable resource development. When spaces become less Indigenous, or more populated by settlers, Indigenous peoples lose influence over issues pertinent to the well-being of their land and way of life. In short, the settler state's economic interests in the North worked to create a space where Indigenous populations became almost irrelevant, or a burden, similarly to an urban center like Ottawa. The result of these forces is quite obvious and relate directly to our coursework. Today, public spaces and sites of leisure exist to further the interests of private landowners. Moreover, these sites frequently erase any mention of their Indigenous context, and rarely, if ever, include any visual reminders of the territory on which they exist.